Our next speaker is Corinne Keet. Corinne is an expert in allergies in children, particularly in food allergies, and she'll be talking to us about can we finally eat that peanut. Thank you.
Thank you. So, okay. Thank you. So I'm a pediatric allergist and epidemiologist and a clinical researcher. So my perspective is a little bit less in the lab and more on the population level. And I wanted to talk about really big changes we've had in our ways of preventing peanut allergy in the this last year or so too. But first to talk about food allergy overall. So food allergy is a specific immune response like we've been talking about today. All these immune responses, a specific immune response to a food that most commonly occurs because of IgE antibodies, a specific kind of antibody that occur that are formed by exposure to the food and require this prior exposure to have a reaction. There's currently no FDA-approved treatment for food allergy, although there are 2 medications at least, or 2 pharmaceutical products that are in phase 3 trials that don't have time to talk about today, but I'd be happy to talk about any time. So right now, the only accepted management of food allergy is to avoid the food and to use epinephrine if needed for a reaction, so EpiPen. In general, food allergy appears to be increasing and pretty rapidly. In particular, peanut allergy is the one that seems to be increasing rapidly. And food allergy goes along with other allergic diseases, and particularly is very closely tied to eczema or atopic dermatitis, depending, the allergists and dermatologists call it different things, which is a major risk factor for food allergy. So what I want to talk about today is about the very big changes we've had in the prevention of peanut allergy, which are reflected in the guidelines from our national organizations, which in 2000 suggested that it would be, although they were not very conclusive, they suggested that it would be reasonable to delay peanut till age 3 as well as other allergenic foods as well, and promoted breastfeeding at that time. By 2008, our national society said, well, actually, there's really not very much data, so we're retracting that recommendation. You should do what you want. We have no data. And then this year, in January, the new guidelines say that actually, if you are at high risk of peanut allergy because you have eczema or have another food allergy, really infants should be eating peanut-containing foods as early as 4 to 6 months. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we got to the guidelines in 2000 and how what's happened to change since then. Because I think that the story is instructive about some of the perils of making guidelines and about how we deal with evidence. So if you actually look at the 2000 guidelines, they're really not focused on peanut allergy or on introducing solids. So if you look at the title at the bottom, the title of the talk that these guidelines were drawn from is actually about hypoallergenic infant formulas. And really the focus was on whether infants at high risk of food allergy should breastfeed longer and should introduce more hypoallergenic formulas. And then as a aside, they said, well, since we're giving these recommendations, it seems reasonable, even though we don't have much data, to say we should delay allergenic foods, till a year for milk, 2 years for egg, and 3 years for peanut, fish, and shellfish. But as we'll see, there was very little data. And these were really a response to very significant changes that had been made in the 20th century about infant feeding. But if you look back, there's no real Garden of Eden for infant feeding. As long as we've had human civilization, people have tried to find alternatives to breastfeeding, either by necessity or because they wanted to. And so as early as 4,000 years ago, there were infant feeder, usually this would be cows or goats' milk that infants would be fed at that time. By the 19th century, these were more sophisticated, but these methods were, because of the lack of hygiene that was available and the lack of nutritional knowledge, most of the infants who were not breastfed and were artificially fed actually ended up dying. And the most common way if people wanted to or were not able to breastfeed was to actually employ another woman to breastfeed for their child. In certain classes, this was very widespread in certain times. So it wasn't really until the 20th century, the early 20th century, that formulas began to be patented. We had clean water and the ability to wash bottles so that infants wouldn't die when you fed them non-breast milk from a human. And so by the 1940s, actually, most infants were going home from the hospital on infant formula and not on breastfeeding. And along with this came changes in the way that other foods were introduced. It was the commercialization of baby foods, whereas previously maybe infants were fed gruel. I think there's quite a variety of ways that people were fed, or the parents chewed the foods for them, which introduces a lot of bacteria, which may have an effect. This commercialization of baby foods led to what was promoted more earlier and earlier introduction. And this, I don't know if you can see, was in the 1960s was a infant guide which suggested that solid foods should be introduced at 2 to 3 days of age, that strained meats by 14 days, by 5 weeks eggs, and that at 9 weeks the infant, just like dad, should be eating bacon and eggs. And you can see throughout all of this that the infant feeding is really tied up in our views about how an infant should relate to the mother, what mothers are doing besides feeding their child, and how independent infants should feed. So by the 1960s, compared to earlier in the century, most infants were starting to be fed foods other than milk by age 4 to 6 weeks compared to 6 to 7 months earlier. And accompanying all these changes, there was a pretty big backlash. So starting in the 1930s, people started to say that they thought that eczema was related to some of this infant formula feeding, that there was increase in eczema. And the infant formulas at that time did have some nutritional deficits that probably were even more associated with eczema beyond the issues of breastfeeding. And then over the following decades, there was more evidence, although pretty weak, about that breastfeeding was protective against eczema and some of these allergic diseases. And then by the 1980s, the formula companies started to develop new formulas that were hydrolyzed, where the milk proteins were broken down. And those started to be tested in randomized studies about prevention of food allergy. There were some studies that combined this with delaying solids, but there were actually no studies that looked specifically at whether delaying peanut prevented peanut allergy. But overall, these, as well as some of the basic science, led to this theory that in infancy, similarly to what the previous speaker, that there was a particularly leaky gut in early infancy and that the immune system was really pro-allergenic at that time. And if we delayed the introduction of allergens, we might be able to prevent allergy. And that's what led to those 2000 recommendations. But over the next decade, that people started to say, well, is this really the best thing? So even though people started to delay allergens longer and longer, there was still more and more food allergy. And so the story is that one of the authors of this paper, Gideon Lack, who's a professor in the UK, is giving a talk about peanut allergy. And one of the people in the audience was an Israeli allergist. And he said, you know, we really don't have much peanut allergy in Israel, and I don't wonder why. And so they did an epidemiologic study and found that the rate of peanut allergy among Jewish children in the UK was about 10 times that of Jewish children in Israel, 0.17% in Israel compared to almost 2% in the UK. And then they also noted, this is not a kind of study that can establish causality, but they also noted that Israeli infants typically ate a teething food that was peanut. It's called bamba, which is like a peanut Cheeto, and because of the kosher dietary laws, that's a common snack that's eaten in Israel. And so infants in Israel were eating about 7 grams of peanut a month compared to none for most British infants. So they suggested that this might be the reason, and then maybe we had it all backwards. And then they did a clinical trial that was done in the UK but funded by the NIH. And the story goes that's because it was considered too risky to do in the US, although I'm not 100% how true that is. But they took infants who were 4 to 11 months of age with severe eczema or egg allergy, who were the highest risk infants. They split them into two. One half, they said, don't eat any peanut products until 5 years of age, and the other half, eat it at least 3 times a week. And they did exclude about 11% because they had a big enough skin prick test that they thought they were already allergic, but they included those who had smaller that they thought were less likely to be allergic. And then I guess you can't see, but the final outcome was determined by food challenge. So at food challenge, at 5 years of age, they said, are you allergic or not? Let's feed you peanut and see. That's our gold standard in food allergy for what we decide if you're allergic or not. And the people who were in the avoidance group, 17% of those kids had peanut allergy at 5 years of age, compared to only 3% in the consumption group. And most of the 3% were peanut allergic when they were infants. So this is an 82% reduction, which is really, really large for prevention studies. And so this really changed. This was a randomized controlled trial, our sort of highest level of evidence, and changed how we thought about things. And this is what led to the newest guidelines. So the newest guidelines came together as an NIH-sponsored meeting of the various pediatric and allergy committees. And they, after some discussion, said that infants who had severe eczema or egg allergy, so this is really based largely on that trial, that they should introduce peanut as early as 4 to 6 months of age. This is a little bit controversial. Other parts of the document say that it should be introduced at 4 to 6 months of age, or whether it should be later. We actually don't have much data about 4 to 6 months or a little bit later. And they also recommend, for the first time in allergy setting, that these infants should have testing before they introduce peanut. Previous guidelines had all said you should see whether you have allergy by eating a food and not by testing before you have it. For other infants with more mild eczema, they should introduce maybe around 6 months of age. And for everyone else, they should introduce it in an age and culturally appropriate way. So you might ask, what about other foods? There's not just peanut allergy. Egg allergy is actually more common. There's now been about 6 studies done of egg allergy. Some of them show benefit, some of them don't. But what they all show is that when they use this egg powder, which 4 of the studies have done, concentrated egg powder, that a large number of infants react much more than you would expect based on what we know generally about egg allergy. So it seems to be very allergenic. The studies of baked egg, where egg, when it's baked, is broken down, those seem to be better. We don't have guidelines yet, and they're not in the process of making guidelines, but if I were to make the guidelines, I would make them about using more cooked or baked egg for prevention of egg allergy. We have no studies yet of tree nuts, fish, or shellfish, and these allergies tend to have a different natural history, and the milk data is difficult to interpret. So I think, just to reflect on how we went wrong, I think we gave these broad sweeping recommendations based on really very low quality evidence, and although there were caveats in the recommendations, I think it's very hard for those to be translated into the actual practice of pediatrics. We recommend things or we don't. We don't say, well, we don't know, or maybe it is, maybe it's not. By the time it gets to people's lives, those caveats are ignored. We reason from faulty mechanistic theories. We gave into the pressure to do something. And I think this one worries me. We underestimated the potential harm from our guidelines. So I just wanted to close with the questions that keep me up at night about this field, that beyond, what I think we all worry about it as well, and as well beyond the funding issues. But I worry about the unintended consequences of our new guidelines, which I worry about whether this recommendation for screening will lead to more diagnoses, false diagnoses of food allergy, because food allergy testing is very poor, and we know that there are a lot of people who test positive who don't really have the disease, and the only way to know is to feed the food. I worry that our screening will overwhelm our available medical resources, and I also worry whether people will actually introduce peanut earlier, people who need to introduce it, or whether there'll be too much anxiety. And then I don't have time to talk about the new treatments, but I'm happy to talk to anybody individually. I do worry about these treatments as well, about the long-term outcomes, about questions of what exactly we're treating. I just wanted to put these out there as issues that we could talk about sometime, and whether these will lead to more reactions or fewer, and if there may be other ways to reduce anxiety and improve freedom in children's lives that may be less medicalized. So I'm open to questions. There's a lot of things that are changing in this field, and I think it's very exciting.
Yes, I'm wondering if there is any other relationship with development or progress of eczema associated with whether people are immunized, so to speak, whether they are breastfed and so forth later in life?
Yeah, so the sort of current theory is that eczema causes food allergy because the exposure to the allergen through an irritated skin leads to an allergenic response versus exposure through the mouth that leads to tolerance. And so there are studies going on about trying to improve the eczema by using a moisturizer from birth and whether that might reduce the risk of allergy. Is that your question? Is that answering your question?
I was wondering more about whether there was a common mechanism associated with food allergies and the eczema, and whether avoiding the development of food allergies caused less progression of eczema.
Yeah,
And vice
so
versa.
it's been a major controversy in the field about why eczema and food allergy are so closely related. Is it because there's a common immune defect that causes them both, common genetics that cause them both, or is it that the eczema is causing the food allergy, or is the food allergy causing the eczema? And I think probably all of those things are true for some patients, but overall, more and more evidence is accumulating that eczema itself causes food allergy because of the skin barrier breakdown. And there's some of that evidence is genetic defects in the skin barrier causing an increased risk of food allergy. And there's some of it is mouse models and other models that show that if you irritate the skin, inflame the skin, and you put food on it, then you get an immune response. So there are attempts to prevent that process through skin care. In terms of whether treating food allergy makes eczema less, I'm not aware of studies of that, but it's an interesting question.
Hi, that was super fascinating. Thank you. My question is maybe a little more like nitty-gritty than your
Yeah.
broad talk, but
Yeah, it's very
so
broad.
when people develop peanut allergies, is it an appropriate immune response to a specific protein in the peanut or different proteins in the peanut? And if so, is there any like structural similarity to some protein on a worm or a pathogen or something?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there are different peanut proteins, and you can be sensitized to different peanut proteins. There's one called RH2, which is a seed storage protein that tends to be the most people who have true peanut allergy are sensitized to. There are peanut allergy proteins, one called ARA-H8, so these are just numbered, that has homology with pollen allergies, and people who are sensitized more to that tend to have more mild symptoms. In terms of why certain proteins cause allergy and other proteins don't, I think, which is maybe underlying your question. Some of them, we know that the things that cause allergy tend to be heat resistant, so they're the things that are broken down in the early processes of digestion don't tend to cause systemic reactions or to cause major allergy. Some of them have enzymatic activity so they sort of mimic danger. I don't think with the peanut, we know why peanut. Things like dust mite, they do have, within the dust mite itself causes immune response. That some people, I know in the audience, study this more in the laboratory, but we do know that some allergens have caused certain immune responses besides the antigen specificity. Yes?
As a follow-up to that question, is there a possibility to develop a genetically modified peanut that maybe takes out some of those proteins?
People are working on that. Mm-hmm. There are people who are working on taking out the major allergens of the peanut. Personally, I don't really understand that so much because it's not really going to, I think, to be able to take it out so that somebody who is peanut allergic could eat it, it seems unlikely that you would be able to completely remove the allergenicity. But perhaps you could use those things as treatment because if there was a little bit of allergenicity, and you sort of built up tolerance to it. But there are efforts underway. In North Carolina, there's a company that's trying to do that.
Hi. I was just wondering what the latest is on breastfeeding, and does breastfeeding provide a protective effect for all food allergies, or some, or different, or?
So the current official guidelines are still that breastfeeding helps prevent food allergy. I think when you look at the studies, they're more weak than perhaps that evidence suggests, but there are so many other reasons to breastfeed besides allergy that I think are very strong. In terms of, I don't know if this is your question, but there used to be recommendations that mothers should avoid certain foods during breastfeeding, and there really is very little data for that. What there is data for is if you avoid milk and egg and during breastfeeding or pregnancy, that it leads to nutritional complications for the mother. But there's not good evidence one way or another about whether eating foods while you're breastfeeding helps increases or decreases food allergy.
Can you talk just a little bit about the treatments for these allergies, and medical and non-medical? Is lotion the only non-medical?
No, well, so I guess it depends on how you classify things. So in general, for allergy, for 100 years, we've done immunotherapy where you get allergy shots, put a little bit of an allergen, and you build up immune tolerance to that. When they tried to do that in the 80s for food allergy, people died because the immune response is so strong. But in the last 15 years ago or so, people have started to do oral immunotherapy where you build up small amounts slowly. And there are people in practice who are using that, and there are companies who are now developing a standardized method of that. So that by oral immunotherapy to build that up. There are also patches. So the same idea generally of an allergen, but this is put through the skin. I know I just told you that the skin may cause allergy, but apparently that's not entirely all the time true. If you have it through an intact skin, over time that may reduce the amount that somebody reacts to that allergen as well. Does that answer your question, or?
Yeah, and the non-medical is?
Oh, well, so you could do the oral immunotherapy kind of at home or in a practice by just eating small amounts of the food. But the problem is it's very small amounts, and the people have a lot of reactions during these treatments. And so that's why the main allergy community says we really don't think that's ready. It's something that can be used in clinical practice right now. But that's one of the approaches that's being used.